Well, welcome to the Swiss cheese model for dealing with excessive police violence. This is a project by airsafe.com, which I've started recently in response to many of the things that have been happening in the United States with respect to police violence. Of course, George Floyd is the most famous of these, happening in late May, but there have been others since then, including about a week or so before this recording in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a person who was being detained by police or questioned by police. The end of the story was this person was unarmed, ended up with 7 bullets in the back. Now, much of the public discussion has been around systemic police violence, systemic racism in the criminal justice system, etc. Those are all legitimate topics, but the topic today is much more narrow. My background's in aviation safety, and one of the tools that we use in aviation safety in my career there, including at Boeing and other places, was we had a complex process, a complex system, not just of the aircraft, but of the design process, regulatory systems, legal systems, etc. So when it came to addressing issues that resulted in plane crashes, it wasn't enough just to point to one overall cause saying, oh, it's that thing over there. It was a process of looking often at a complex system, looking at how the various parts fit together, looking at the sequence of events that led to an accident, and then focusing on one aspect that if you change that, you'd reduce the risk. And risk in this case is fairly narrowly defined as a bad outcome that you don't want to have, and the likelihood of that outcome. And there are 3 basic ways to deal with risk. You eliminate it entirely, you make it less likely to happen, or you put things in place such that the effects aren't as bad. In this case, when it comes to excessive force in policing, eliminating it entirely isn't an option, because that would mean eliminating any possibility of excessive force by police. And that means eliminating police as we know them. And that's not really a viable option. And the option of dealing with the effects, making them less serious when they occur, perfectly reasonable, but it's better and probably a lot more leverage if you go at the beginning of it and try to make it less likely to occur. Now, in the exercise today, I had a fairly straightforward scenario of a routine police stop, a pedestrian stop. And I picked that for a specific reason. One of them being that, in the US at least, many of us who drive, through osmosis, through driver's ed, through our parents, whatever, we know that if a cop pulls you over, they're going to ask for license, registration, proof of insurance type of thing. You may not know the full range of what might happen, but you know at least at the beginning, there's a certain rhythm to it. You pull over safely to the side of the road, cut the engine off, roll down the window, policeman asks you, or police officer asks you for license, registration, proof of insurance, and it goes from there. With a pedestrian stop, there isn't that kind of common knowledge, a pedestrian ed, if you will, or for that matter, most people don't have close relatives who've had a lot of experience being pulled over as a pedestrian. So really, where does one learn how to do this sort of thing? So looking at that process, I came up with my own checklist of what to do, or rather something I would tell someone who knew nothing about life in these United States. What do you do if you're walking down the street and a policeman or police officer stops you? And what surprised me was that there were so many details to the checklist which literally I never thought about, because it wasn't something that was top of mind or even bottom of mind. But when I looked at this the way I would look at an airplane crash, that is, what sort of checklist, what sort of procedures, whether normal procedures, non-normal procedures, or emergency procedures were in place. So with that preamble, Jonathan or Dr. Pettey, as you prefer,
either.
I'd like to get your feedback on what you think about the materials I sent out beforehand, which included the checklist I talked about, and also the overall idea of looking at policing as a system safety situation.
Yeah, and I think I'll start with talking towards the Swiss cheese model, which makes plenty of sense. So to give a little background or context to where I come from, right now I am serving on a police, I guess you could say, a police reform committee. So we are actually looking at what the community is saying about the police department where I live, how they feel about contacts police have with people. And so this fits in very well with what I'm dealing with right now.
Let me interrupt you just briefly. I'm going to put up the Swiss cheese model on the board so that anyone looking at the video can see this. Are you seeing that now?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
Very good. And let me just give you a quick background for the audience before you continue with your response. Basically, the model is every layer of Swiss cheese acts as a barrier against something bad happening. At the beginning, on the left-hand side, you see the hazards. That is, what are the things that you're dealing with? That red arrow, rather, is the path that one takes from a situation where you start with some sort of hazards in the background or the foreground. And if things go wrong, that is, if you pass through every layer of protection, you come out the other end, you have some sort of loss. In the case of police pedestrian stop, a civilian is seriously injured or killed who was otherwise not threatening, not armed, etc. And the 4 layers here, you have, it's a generic model, fairly simplified. The first layer being law enforcement organization, their training, their selection of officers, their management officers. Second layer being the officer decision and actions in the field. The third layer being the civilian decision and actions in the field. And you could argue that those 2 layers should be not so separate, but they sort of intertwine and interact. And the fourth layer being the officer response to the civilian actions. So with that, I would like to stop sharing and go back to looking at you as the main person. Ooh, hope I did that right. I may not have. I wanted to have you as the main person on the screen for now. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and I think that was, I don't know,
That
probably was my
totally
end.
me. I tried
Oh, was
to,
it? No.
I tried to get the sharing thing off the screen, and I clicked on your screen, and somehow or another that killed you.
No, I thought it was mine. My internet's been spotty last couple of days.
Regardless, we're back in full effect right now, and I hope you got the full briefing on the model. Let me have your response to that. And you were talking about your participation in a police in a board dealing with police training, accountability, etc. Let's pick it up from there.
Yes, correct. Okay, and to add another layer to the context, I served for about 15 years in public safety as a firefighter. So different uniform, similar line of work, or similar organizational cultures, I should say. So some of the things that we've seen through the police committee, a lot of talk about it's the officer problem, it's the contact person that they come in contact with as the problem. But either way, it's one layer. And this actually makes a lot more sense as I think it through back from my public safety day and through discussions we have today and what I see as the problem, which is you have your policies and you have different policies in different places, like your hiring policy, which is outlined on your graph. You have your officer interactions, your officer personalities, you have your contact personalities, and they all have factors involved. So it makes complete sense that it's not one barrier that needs to be addressed, but a layer of them, like Swiss cheese layer. What was I going to say? So when I was looking through the checklist, so the Swiss cheese makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes a great sense for a way to approach researching how to make change in police contacts. When I was looking through the checklist, I was trying to frame what your checklist had in it against stories that I had heard on this committee. And the stories, to give context to those listening, have varied from one extreme end, people being very positive about the police and very adamant that we don't defund police, to people on the other end talking about these extreme stories that have left trauma in their minds from even as early as early childhood about interactions with police and everything in between.
By the way, I have the checklist on the
I was
screen.
reading through it, and a lot of it makes sense.
Very good.
Oh, good.
I'm at the after being stopped by police portion of it. I just scrolled to the after being stopped by police portion of it.
Perfect. And that was where I had thoughts. So it makes all complete sense, all the things you talk about. I agree with them. I think some things that bubble up as points of, what am I trying to say? Points that might make it challenging for people to meet some of the bullet points, like remain calm. So we had at least one person come talk to us about how, as a child, they had their mother pulled out of a car and arrested at gunpoint for a traffic violation. And so her experiences with the thought of police, not just interacting with police, but just thinking about the police, is anxiety driven. And so I look at the checklist and I think about, how the tools that would also have to be added in to help people realize is remaining calm is something they have to do even with their anxiety.
With that note that you made, perhaps
and then
remain as calm as you can is realistic, because quite frankly, every time I'm pulled over, even for a minor traffic thing, it's not a normal situation. Heart rate goes up, you're a little bit nervous. Who knows what might happen? And it's going through your head. I'm looking calm on the outside, but I'm a little bit hyped up on the inside.
Yeah, I agree completely. There's nothing normal with the contact with the police or anyone in public safety.
By the way, I'm going to write a note
from a public safety point of view. We know that
I'm going to put something in the chat box just so I can remember that. And if we had a larger group here, that thought would be shared. So go ahead, keep talking.
Yeah. So there are points where the other concerns I have for the individual, these are things they would have to learn, is the idea of taking a citation and leaving. I think some may feel it challenging to accept the violation without being able to put up an argument. They might not understand that they can appeal these issues at a later time. I think a lot of this is, as you said, this isn't something we inherently learn, because these things don't happen very often. You don't get stopped walking around very often, hopefully. If you do, I think that's a horrible, unfortunate existence.
Now, I'd like to scroll to the test case that's at the bottom of this, which literally happened like the day before I did my first briefing. This was in San Antonio. Coincidentally, I grew up in San Antonio. And this was a person who was jogging down the street. He kind of looked like a suspect. He was pulled over. Something happened. Words were exchanged. And he was initially arrested and charged with 2 felonies on the police officers. Those felonies were dropped. But what struck me here was in the state of Texas, the law explicitly states that you don't have to provide even your name when an officer stops you. And not a driver's license, not anything, not even say your name. You'd be perfectly within the law. And some of the arguments I've seen, and they're legitimate arguments, is, well, wouldn't it make sense to ease the situation and just give them that kind of information? My point of view is perfectly right, that it would make sense. But the law, although it's a little bit backwards, is the law. So there is something where you could have a civilian who is perfectly aware of the law, is standing on legal grounds, but might tick off the police officer in the meantime. So it's one of these situations where it's not cut and dried. And just because there's a protective layer there, in this case, the laws of the state of Texas, doesn't mean that the layer will be a protective, of protective value to the civilian.
Yeah, agreed. Now, I was reading that case and thinking about it. I think some of the other things, when I looked through the checklist and the model, so my research is mostly in leadership and in social identity. So one of the things that comes to mind is how the officer identifies with the community and vice versa, how the person, the contact, identifies with the police officer, or if they don't. My perspective would be that often the officer and the contact are separate social identities. The person being contacted doesn't feel that they're part of the police. Obviously, they're not. And the police officers, an argument that's come from the community quite a bit is police officers don't always identify with their community. An example would be maybe they don't live in the community, maybe they don't integrate very much in the community when they're working there, things along those natures. And I think that's one of the other layers that winds up being part of the model, is adding in that layer of identity or shared identity between officers and the communities they serve. It may have holes, it will have holes, but it will add an extra layer.
In a large, complex community, and again, this is based on my San Antonio experience, you can be literally in the same community and be physically and culturally so far apart that it's like you're living in different worlds. There's some parts of town where, in fact, all parts of town, where seeing Spanish on billboards and whatnot is a normal sort of thing. You go to another city, you may not see that. So from an outsider's perspective, that's kind of weird. But more to the point, you have areas of town where Spanish being spoken is a normal thing. Having large numbers of people who are from other countries or related directly to someone from another country, and that's a norm, is in the other side of town could be completely different backgrounds. So same city, heck, even the same high school, and you can have wildly different worlds, even though you're from the same community.
Yeah, I completely agree. And even from a small town perspective, I guess maybe where I live is not exactly a small town in the sense of what I think of it, but it's definitely not a big city or a metropolis. We still have those issues. And, let's community talk about police officers and this exact situation of, do the police officers, are they part of the community? Do they understand the community? I recognize that there's no way that you can have all the officers integrate completely with the whole community. We have our own neighborhoods, we have our own subgroups. I think one of the solutions is trying to find ways to, if you're running officers in pairs, specifically, trying to make sure that that's not a homogeneous pair, that they have a diversity in thought, they have a diversity in background. It might give them also a chance to have a diversity in what they think when they make that initial contact, so that when one sees the other maybe making a misstep, they might be able to slow down the process and avoid an unfortunate outcome. And then trying to circulate the officers throughout the community.
Let me put the Swiss cheese model. I did speaker view. I thought I knocked you off again. Let me put that. Okay, just for reference, just have that Swiss cheese model up and around again.
Yep, still here.
Very good. Now, getting back to the Swiss cheese model
Yeah.
and wrenching the conversation back toward the middle lane, one of the goals of the model when applied in the aviation world that I came from, same goal here. Is there a takeaway? What kind of takeaway do we have? Two kinds. One, do the stakeholders have a better understanding of how the system, it might be bigger than they thought it was, and how there are elements of the system can be rather complex and issues come up. But the goal is to keep that last event, the losses, from happening. And my point when I was going through the checklist is just having a vague understanding of the kind of things that one should do if stopped as a pedestrian will reduce the likelihood of things turning sour during the encounter. Now, this is not going to prevent a police officer with extremely racist tendencies from being the police officer who's in front of you. It's not going to prevent, a gun from accidentally going off, but it may prevent the things that are there from bubbling to the front and becoming a dangerous thing for that civilian. And my takeaway when I put together the list was, well, gee, this could be an educational thing for the community as a whole. It's like, hey, I know being stopped by a cop while you're walking down the street, innocent, minding your own business, will tick you off to no end. But in this community, and I say this community specific to whatever community that is where the laws are going to be different, in this community, this is how the game is played. If you understand the rules, you're less likely to step out of bounds. Doesn't prevent you from winning or losing, but it does help you stay within the rules of the game.
Makes complete sense. And I think one of the opportunities for this model comes in building that collaboration between community and police. So your checklist gives a good starting point for, say, maybe police going out and talking to youth and saying, hey, here's how we come across an interaction and how we would the things that you can do to mitigate elevating the anxiety at the scene. And then that opens dialogue, hopefully, between the community and the police. So the community can say, yeah, we see what you're saying, we agree, we understand, we'll take these to heart. Here are parts that we think maybe we can give as input for maybe how you can change your policies and how you can change your interactions. So that the list becomes more accessible to both sides, which should be in, and also can become more tailored towards that community, whichever community it is. Because, as you said, laws are different where you are in the country.
I just typed a note because it crossed my mind. Something you said earlier about people might find it hard to not argue with the officer. And one of the things that came across my mind when I was putting together the checklist is, if you ask the officer, am I free to go? And they say, yes, you walk away. Or if you realize that all you're going to get is a talking to or a warning and not a citation, not an arrest, how do you fight the urge, or one should fight the urge of talking back to the person saying, you're not anything because, you're just giving me a warning. You stopped me for nothing. You're this, that, and the other. I'm saying it's okay to have those thoughts. It's just not very smart to mouth off to the officer. And you can say that until the cows come home. And even if you have a formal educational class with members of the community, especially rowdy teenagers full of hormones, it may not take for most of them. But again, my goal is to make it less likely that a bad outcome happens. And just getting to the beginning part, getting people sitting around, recognizing that this is a real thing and there are things they can can personally do to decrease their risk. If we get to that point, we win.
Yeah, so, I agree. Every reduction in
now, for a couple of reasons, I'm trying to stay within my unwritten format
in the right direction.
We've come to, we've had a bit of a discussion here. We've had some takeaways. I'd like to have you have the last formal takeaway from this. That is, what are the next steps you think might be useful in general and for you in particular?
I think in general, and speaking towards the model is to take it to police departments and take it to communities to discuss, this is what we see. This is, the issues that face our community right now. These are proven methods of looking at how to reduce risk and explaining it and then starting a dialogue. I think it's a great way to start dialogue, and I think it's a great way to start increasing understanding on both sides about how certain little layers, certain little incidents can all add up to one whole that just lines up the wrong way, an unfortunate outcome. And for myself, I think, takeaway from me is this is a model I hadn't seen. I'd had ideas that make sense now in this model. I just didn't realize that there was a model and the methodology behind it, which is probably going to lead to a lot more reading on my end, and then hopefully pushes in spaces that I have to make change in police departments and the community I live in.
You just made me think of one last thing, which is add more Swiss cheese references to the document. And there's a wealth of academic and non-academic work that's been done in this area. And a lot of it is, let's just say that a lot of it is kind of wordy. I sort of broke down the very basic parts, had a very simplified model. And my goal was, hey, in a half hour or less, can I lay this on the table, give people enough of an idea to run with it? And that's all my goal is right now. And like you said, you hadn't seen this model before. I take it for granted that this is like all over the place in the industrial world. But this is not the industrial world we're dealing with. Yeah. But it is a world of complex accidents. And that's why the model, I think, is appropriate. So I'd like to thank you for your participation.
Yeah.
At this point, I'm going to cut off the recording or stop recording. And let's see now.